lawyer, fresh from the courthouse, suddenly finds himself in handcuffs right on the courthouse steps. The police officer doesn't ask questions, doesn't listen to a single explanation. In an instant, dignity collides with prejudice, and what should have been an ordinary day turns into a shocking scene of injustice. What really happened, and why did this unfold in front of so many witnesses? Stay with us until the end of this video to find out, and before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? Jonathan Carter pushed open the great wooden doors of the courthouse and stepped into the sunlight. He looked like a man at ease with himself, though those who knew him best understood it was never truly ease, it was discipline. It was the calm armor he had learned to wear in a world that often saw his skin before it saw his worth. He stood tall, a broad-shouldered black man in a charcoal suit, his tie knotted tight against his throat. In his hand was a weathered leather briefcase, its brass clasps dulled with age. It had belonged to his father, a man who had marched down streets lined with police dogs and fire hoses, who had fought not in courtrooms, but in crowded protests where justice was demanded with chants that shook the air. That briefcase was more than Jonathan's tool. It was a legacy. Every time he carried it, he carried a piece of his father's fight and his ancestors' prayers. Jonathan Carter was no ordinary lawyer. He had carved his way through the ivy-covered walls of a top university, argued cases that changed lives, stood up for men and women who had been silenced by poverty, by power, by prejudice. And yet, no matter how high he climbed, he knew he could never outrun a certain shadow the instant judgment cast upon him because of the color of his skin. Across the street, a man watched. His name was David Miller, a police officer in uniform, his badge gleaming in the sun, his boots polished to regulation shine. On the surface, he looked like every other officer who had taken an oath to protect and serve. But inside, David carried something heavier than the pistol on his hip. He carried assumptions, sharpened over years, handed down in silence. David had grown up in a small Midwestern town, where conversations about race were never spoken aloud, but where the lessons were clear. A glance from his father when a black man walked down their street. A whisper from his mother about which neighborhoods were safe and which were troubled. These unspoken truths had carved lines in David's thinking, lines he had never challenged, never even named. And now, as a police officer, those lines had become reflex. When David's radio crackled earlier that morning with a report of a robbery suspect, a black male, dark clothing, his body tensed. And as his eyes fell on Jonathan stepping down those courthouse stairs, briefcase in hand, the grooves of old prejudice did the rest. His heart quickened, his gaze hardened. He didn't see Jonathan the lawyer, Jonathan the father's son, Jonathan the defender of justice. He saw a suspect. The contrast between them was stark, almost cinematic. One man carried dignity like a banner, earned through struggle, sharpened by discipline. The other carried authority like a shield, granted by uniform, but warped by bias he had never questioned. Two men moving toward the same point on the street, carrying histories that would soon crash together in a way neither could undo. Jonathan reached the bottom of the courthouse steps and adjusted the strap of his briefcase. His mind was elsewhere, replaying arguments from the case he had just finished. He thought about his client, a young woman who had finally been granted custody of her children after years of fighting a system that seemed determined to keep her down. Jonathan felt the satisfaction of a man who had delivered justice, who had done his part to push the world 1 inch closer to fairness. But even as he walked toward his car, his peace was fragile. For Jonathan knew he had always known that in this country, peace for a black man was a temporary condition. One wrong glance, one mistaken assumption, and that peace could be shattered like glass on concrete. David shifted his weight, his eyes locked on Jonathan. The officer's breath grew shallow, his fingers brushing the edge of his holster. The instructions from his training echoed in his head. Act fast. Don't hesitate. Trust your instincts. And his instincts, poisoned by years of unexamined prejudice, were whispering a lie. This man is dangerous. This man doesn't belong. Jonathan, unaware of the storm brewing just yards away, slipped his car keys from his pocket. The morning light glinted off his wedding band, a symbol of the life he had built with patience, with love, with relentless determination. He thought only of getting home, of of the warm smile of his wife, of the laughter of his daughter waiting at the kitchen table. He thought he was finished with battles for the day, but as he reached for the door handle, a shadow stretched across the pavement. It was the shadow of David Miller, stepping forward with narrowed eyes, his hand hovering near his weapon, his voice ready to cut through the morning stillness. Two men, two stories, two Americas, and in the space of a single breath their paths would collide, not because of guilt, not because of crime, but because of the oldest wound this nation has yet to heal. The morning that began with steady footsteps on marble was about to end with the clash of dignity against prejudice, justice against assumption, and the question waiting to be answered was as old as the Republic itself. What happens when the very guardians of justice cannot see past the color of a man's skin? The first words cut through the morning like a blade. Hands where I can see them. Jonathan froze, the car keys slipping slightly in his grasp. He turned slowly, the way a man turns when he knows sudden movements can cost him more than dignity. His eyes fell on the figure striding across the pavement, uniformed, armed, his hand poised near the holster. Officer David Miller's voice carried the sharpness of command, but beneath it was something else, fear, suspicion, the kind that has no evidence, no foundation, only instinct, the kind of instinct that has written too many tragedies in America's streets. Jonathan's heart tightened. Not in panic, but in bitter recognition. He had lived long enough to know what this was. A black man in a suit, a lawyer walking away from the courthouse, was transformed in the eyes of a white officer into something far more dangerous, a suspect. Officer, there must be a mistake, Jonathan began, his tone calm, measured, the tone of a man who had argued before judges, who had learned to keep his voice steady even when the world wanted to shake him. But David was already closing the distance, boots pounding against the concrete, eyes narrowed with a certainty he had not earned. He barked again, louder this time, as though volume could disguise the fragility of his judgment. I said, hands up, now. Around them, the street seemed to pause. Pedestrians slowed, eyes widening, whispers starting to hum through the air. Phones were pulled from pockets, the glow of their screens catching the morning light as people began to record. Jonathan lifted his hands, his briefcase dangling from one wrist like an anchor of truth. I am Jonathan Carter, he said, voice resonant, each word chosen with precision. I am an attorney. I just walked out of that courthouse behind me. He motioned slightly with his chin toward the building, a stone monument to law and order that suddenly felt like a mocking backdrop. But David wasn't listening. He wasn't hearing Jonathan's words, or seeing the confidence in his posture, or recognizing the quiet dignity of a man who had dedicated his life to the very law David claimed to enforce. What David saw was a story his mind had already written. Black male, dark clothing, moving quickly toward a car. A threat, a shadow, a stereotype dressed in a suit. Drop the bag, David snapped. And when Jonathan hesitated because that bag was his father's, because that bag was his history, David lunged forward. In one swift, unthinking motion, he seized Jonathan's arm, yanked it behind his back, and snapped the cold metal of handcuffs around his wrists. The sound was small, a metallic click, but it cracked through the air like thunder. The crowd gasped. Murmurs rose into shouts. He didn't do anything, someone called. That's a lawyer, not a criminal. Another voice cried. The cell phone stayed lifted, capturing every second, every angle, every injustice. Jonathan's face tightened, not with fear, but with something deeper, something heavier. Humiliation, anger, a sorrow so old it seemed to echo from generations past. He felt the bite of steel at his wrists and thought of his father's hands, once shackled by laws written to keep him from the ballot box, from the classroom, from dignity. And now here he was, his own son, shackled again, this time by an officer who mistook skin for guilt. David pressed Jonathan against the hood of the car, his breath heavy, his voice clipped. You fit the description, he muttered, as though the words could justify the violence, as though vague suspicion could outweigh truth. Jonathan turned his head, his cheek pressed to the cool metal of his car, his eyes locking onto the lenses of the cameras aimed his way. His voice, though strained, carried like a bell. You are making a grave mistake. I am not your suspect. I am an officer of the court. I am an attorney at law. The officer's grip faltered for a fraction of a second. The words sliced through his certainty, but pride held him fast. He tightened the cuffs, as if to cling to authority in the face of crumbling judgment. The moment hung heavy in the air, a collision of dignity and prejudice, truth and assumption. The crowd grew louder, their outrage swelling. Strangers shouted demands for release. Others cursed the officer. And Jonathan, his wrists bound, lifted his voice once more, not to the officer, but to the witnesses, to the nation itself. "See this," he said. "See what happens when justice wears blinders. See how quickly a man becomes guilty, not because of his actions, but because of his color." The words rippled through the gathering, searing themselves into the digital record that was even now being broadcast live to screens far beyond that street. Jonathan's humiliation became testimony. His pain became evident. And David Miller, standing with his suspect, already unraveling into something far more dangerous to him than a criminal, a victim, a symbol, a voice, felt the ground beneath him begin to crack. For in his hands, in those handcuffs, he was not holding a thief or a fugitive. He was holding the embodiment of his own prejudice. He was holding a mirror, one that reflected not Jonathan's guilt, but David's blindness. And in that mirror, the whole country was about to see itself. The handcuffs bit into Jonathan Carter's wrists, the steel cold and unyielding, each click a reminder of centuries of chains that had bound men like him for crimes they never committed. His breath was steady, his eyes unflinching, but inside him surged a storm that carried the weight of humiliation, of anger, of a familiar injustice that had walked alongside him all his life. The crowd pressed closer, their voices swelling into a chorus of disbelief and outrage. The courthouse loomed in the background, its stone pillars casting long shadows, as if the very walls of justice were watching in silence, ashamed. Jonathan lifted his head, the edge of the car pressing against his cheek, and fixed his gaze on the officer who had bound him. His voice, when it came, was not a shout of desperation, but a declaration, measured and precise, resonant with the authority of a man who had spent years speaking truth in rooms designed to silence. "You have made a mistake," he said, his words slicing through the clamor. "I am Jonathan Carter. I am an attorney of this court." The crowd stilled for a beat, the words hanging in the air like a bell struck in the distance. Some gasped, others shouted louder. Phones lifted higher, their cameras zooming in on the moment a black man in handcuffs dared to proclaim not guilt, not defense, but authority that the badge across from him had failed to recognize. Officer David Miller faltered, just for a second, but the slip was visible. His grip on Jonathan's arm loosened, his eyes narrowing as if the very truth being spoken to him was too sharp to look at directly. He had not expected calm. He had not expected confidence. He had not expected the man he had already written into the role of suspect to stand before him and declare himself an officer of the law in his own right. "Proof," David muttered, though his voice cracked, the word trembling with the fragility of doubt. "Show me proof." Jonathan straightened as much as the cuffs allowed, then shifted his bound hands toward the inside pocket of his suit jacket. The officer hesitated, then roughly pulled the wallet free himself, flipping it open with the impatience of a man clinging to authority even as it slipped through his fingers. And there it was, a Bar Association identification card, laminated and official, the gold lettering spelling out a truth that could no longer be denied. Jonathan Carter, attorney at law. David's face drained of color, his mouth opened, but no words came. The crowd, however, needed no further confirmation. A wave of outrage surged forward, voices sharp, furious, unrelenting. "He's a lawyer. You cuffed a lawyer. What the hell is wrong with you? Shame." Phones captured the officer's shock, the lawyer's dignity, the clash of power and prejudice. Within moments, the scene was not just unfolding on the street, it was traveling across the city, across the nation, through every screen, a live indictment of assumptions laid bare. Jonathan met David's eyes, and in that look there was no fear, no submission. There was only a steady, burning clarity. The look of a man who had endured this country's blindness too long to be surprised, but never long enough to accept it. "You understand what you've done?" Jonathan's voice was calm, but beneath the calm was steel. You saw my skin before you saw my humanity. You saw a suspect before you saw a man. And now the world is watching. David staggered back half a step, the badge on his chest suddenly feeling less like a symbol of authority and more like a weight dragging him into the pit of his own failure. His hand twitched toward the cuffs, as if to undo them, but the crowd surged forward, shouting louder, angrier, unwilling to let him simply erase the humiliation already inflicted. Jonathan stood taller, though the cuffs still bound him, and lifted his voice for all to hear. This is what prejudice does. It blinds. It shackles justice. It reduces a man to nothing more than a shadow of suspicion. His words were not just for the officer. They were for the onlookers, for the cameras, for the millions who would see this moment replayed again and again. A mirror held up to a nation that prided itself on liberty, while still stumbling in chains of its own making. The courthouse bells rang in the distance, a sound that should have marked order and peace, but in that moment sounded more like a warning, tolling for a system that had once again betrayed its own promise. David's hand shook as he fumbled with the cuffs, the keys jingling with nervous desperation. He unlocked them at last, the steel falling away, but the damage was done. The marks pressed into Jonathan's wrists were not just bruises on his skin, they were marks on the conscience of every person who saw, who heard, who could no longer deny what prejudice looked like when it wore a uniform. Jonathan rubbed his wrists lightly, then picked up his father's briefcase from the ground where it had fallen, brushing off the dust. He stood, tall and unbroken, his eyes scanning the crowd. There was silence now, a silence charged with meaning. People looked at him not just as a lawyer, not just as a black man, but as a witness, a symbol, a reminder of how fragile justice is when left in the hands of those blinded by fear. He turned back to David, his voice low but sharp enough to pierce the stillness. This is not over. End quote. And it wasn't. For in that instant, with the crowd watching, with the cameras rolling, with the world listening, the truth had been revealed. The question was no longer whether Jonathan was guilty or innocent. The question was whether a nation could face the reflection staring back at it from a pair of handcuffs placed on the wrong man. The video spread like wildfire. By nightfall, the clip of Jonathan Carter standing in handcuffs outside the courthouse had reached millions. It was everywhere, on phones, on televisions, on the evening news, where anchors spoke with grave voices about justice betrayed. Across the country, in kitchens and living rooms, families sat together shaking their heads, some in outrage, some in recognition, some in bitter silence because the scene was too familiar, too true. In that recording, the image of Jonathan's lawyer's badge held against the steel cuffs became iconic, seared into memory like a scar. For many, it was the proof of something they had long said, that prejudice did not need evidence, only a target. And in David Miller's fumbling hands, caught in high definition, the nation saw not just one officer's mistake, but the embodiment of a system blind to its own flaws. The days that followed were stormy. Crowds gathered on the courthouse steps, their chants echoing off the stone columns. Justice for Jonathan. No more blind badges. Protest signs filled the square, painted words in bold strokes, faces stern with determination. Retired judges, fellow attorneys, church leaders, students each added their voice. What had begun as one man's humiliation had become a reckoning. Jonathan did not retreat. He filed suit against the police department, his name now both headline and rallying cry. The lawsuit was more than legal paperwork. It was a declaration that dignity could not be stripped away without consequence. In interviews, Jonathan's words carried the gravity of a man who had been forced to bleed so others might see the wound. This is not about one officer, he said, his tone calm but sharp as steel. It is about a culture that allows fear to override truth, prejudice to outweigh proof. If justice means anything in this country, then it must mean accountability. The trial was swift, yet every day inside the courtroom felt like a drumbeat, each hour tightening the tension. The jury listened as Jonathan's attorneys played the viral video frame by frame. They saw the officer's hand gripping Jonathan's arm, the cuffs locking tight, the badge glinting in his wallet, the crowd shouting in disbelief. They heard Jonathan's words echo in that moment of defiance. See what happens when justice wears blinders. David Miller sat stiff in his chair, his uniform traded for a suit that hung heavy on his shoulders. His lawyer spoke of split-second decision, of mistaken identity, of a good man under pressure. But those words rang hollow against the images burned into the jury's minds. The video needed no interpretation. The truth had already spoken. Outside, the courthouse steps turned into a theater of democracy. Each day, crowds gathered to await the verdict, their signs lifted high, their chants echoing through the air. Some prayed, some wept, others simply stood in silence, bearing witness. Older men and women, veterans of marches from decades past, came with canes and wheelchairs, nodding to one another with the weary recognition of a struggle that had never ended. They had marched for civil rights in the 60s, and now here they were, watching the same fight play out through a lawyer's humiliation captured on a phone screen. At last, the verdict came. The jury found for Jonathan Carter. The police department was ordered to pay damages, not just in dollars, but in a public apology. The statement read aloud in court was stripped of bravado, bare in its admission. We failed to protect, we failed to judge fairly, and we failed Jonathan Carter. But the real blow came with the final decision regarding David Miller. He was dismissed from the force, his badge taken, his career over. For a man who had once stood so tall in his uniform, the loss was crushing. Yet it was the crowd outside who felt the weight lift from their chests. When the news reached them, they erupted not with violence, but with a cathartic roar of vindication. Applause broke out. Strangers hugged one another. Tears streamed down faces. For once, the scales of justice seemed to tip in the right direction. Jonathan emerged from the courthouse into that sea of voices. The cameras swarmed, the microphones crowded near, but he lifted his hand for silence. His words came measured, calm, deliberate, the way a man speaks when he knows the world is listening. Today is not about victory, he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. It is about truth. It is about the idea that no man should be shackled by prejudice, that no badge should be blinded by assumption. I stood in chains not because of who I am, but because of what I look like. And today, justice reminds us that this cannot stand. The cheers rose again, but within them was something more than celebration. It was relief. Relief that, at least for this moment, accountability had a name, and its name was consequence. David Miller left the courthouse through a side door, flanked by silence rather than applause. His eyes avoided the cameras, his steps unsteady. He had entered the force, believing himself the keeper of order, the defender of law. Now he walked away, branded not by crime, but by the exposure of his own blindness. Jonathan stood taller that day, his father's briefcase at his side, his wrists still marked faintly by the cuffs, but his spirit unbroken. Around him, the crowd swelled. Voices joined together not just for him, but for the generations before him, for the men and women who had been silenced, shackled, forgotten. In their victory was not just satisfaction, but the echo of a promise. That dignity, once stolen, could be reclaimed. The bells of the courthouse tolled again, and this time they sounded not like warning, but like release. And for the first time in days, Jonathan allowed himself a long breath of the autumn air, knowing that though the struggle was far from over, justice had, at least for this chapter, prevailed. When the verdict was read, Jonathan Carter felt no triumph. Justice had arrived, but it arrived limping, battered by the weight of what had already been lost. He stood in that courtroom with victory in his hands and bruises still on his wrists. The cheers from the crowd, the headlines, the relief in the voices of strangers, all of it swirled around him. Yet he knew that the deeper story was not about him alone. It was about the nation that had been forced, once again, to look at itself. Jonathan had lived long enough to know that prejudice never needed a reason. It never paused to ask questions or wait for truth. It acted first and justified itself later. His humiliation had proven that in the most public way possible. But it had also given the world something undeniable, an image of injustice that no one could excuse away. And in that, there was power. He thought about the generations that had walked this path before him, men and women who had been stopped, questioned, doubted, humiliated, sometimes broken. They had not always had cameras to capture their truth. They had not always had crowds demanding justice. Too many had carried their stories in silence, swallowed by the dark. His story, recorded and shared, had become something more than personal. It had become a testament. Jonathan understood the temptation to frame his case as a single officer's failure, but the lesson ran deeper. The danger was not just in one man's poor judgment. It was in the reflex itself, in the quickness with which suspicion took root when skin color entered the equation. That reflex was not born in an instant. It was inherited, reinforced, disguised as instinct, and unless it was named for what it was, it would remain. He chose his words carefully when he spoke to reporters, to students, to communities. He did not scold, because he knew scolding closed ears. He did not preach, because he knew people resisted sermons. Instead, he told the truth as he had lived it, that justice can be fragile when blinded by prejudice, that dignity can be stolen in a heartbeat, that freedom is not measured by the absence of chains, but by the absence of suspicion. He told them that what happened to him was not an isolated event. It was a reflection, and reflections can be uncomfortable, but they cannot be ignored. The lesson, Jonathan believed, was not only for law enforcement. It was for neighbors who locked their car doors when a black man walked by. It was for employers who dismissed a resume because of a name that sounded unfamiliar. It was for teachers who lowered expectations without even realizing it. Prejudice was not always loud. More often, it was quiet, automatic, ordinary, and that was what made it so dangerous. But Jonathan also believed in possibility. He had seen prejudice tear down, but he had also seen courage build up. He had seen communities rise together, strangers defending one another, voices demanding better. He believed that every act of recognition, every refusal to judge too quickly, every moment of seeing a person for who they are rather than what they look like, those were victories too, small perhaps, but powerful when multiplied. He never pretended that his story alone would change the nation, but he knew it could plant something, a seed of doubt in the mind of someone who had always trusted their own suspicion. A pause in the reflex of a young officer reaching for handcuffs. A reminder to look twice, to ask, to see. That was enough. The lesson, he realized, was not about punishment, but about vision. A society cannot move forward if it continues to see its people through the narrow lens of stereotype. To honor dignity is to look beyond surface, to acknowledge that every person carries potential no prejudice can erase. Jonathan's bruises healed, but he carried the memory of that day with him. He carried it into every courtroom, into every speech, into every conversation where he was asked what justice meant. He would say, "Justice is not only the verdict delivered by a jury. Justice is the choice we make in everyday moments, whether we assume or whether we ask, whether we judge or whether we see." He wanted people to remember not his pain, but the possibility that had followed. Because in the end, the true victory was not the officer's dismissal or the department's apology. The true victory was the lesson that could no longer be denied, that prejudice, once revealed, forces everyone to choose, to deny it or to confront it, to excuse it or to change. Jonathan carried hope that people, when confronted, might choose change. He believed the story had power not because it ended with his vindication, but because it remained unfinished. Every reader, every viewer, every citizen carried the next chapter in their hands. As he often told those who asked what he had learned, Jonathan would say simply, "Don't measure people by what you see first. See them by what they carry, by what they give, by what they are capable of becoming. We owe that to one another. We owe that to ourselves." And in that quiet truth, spoken without anger, without bitterness, but with the strength of a man who had endured and prevailed, the lesson became clear. Justice does not only belong to the courts. Justice begins in the eyes we use to see each other. Jonathan Carter's story reminds us that true justice is not decided only in a courtroom or written only in the lines of law books. It lives or it fails in the way we see each other every single day. A man was nearly reduced to a suspect simply because of the color of his skin, and yet out of that humiliation came a truth too powerful to ignore. The lesson is simple but profound. Our first judgment of another human being should never be their skin, their accent, or the neighborhood they come from. It should be their character, their choices, their humanity. When Jonathan lifted his voice in the face of injustice, he did not cry out in rage. He stood with dignity, and in that quiet strength he showed us that prejudice does not just wound the victim, it cripples the society that allows it to exist. For every time we choose assumption over understanding, suspicion over compassion, we steal not only from others but from ourselves. The world will not change overnight, but it can change through moments like this, through awareness, through courage, and it begins with us. Each of us holds the choice to see with clear eyes, to speak when silence would be easier, to believe in the worth of another person before we let fear or bias decide for us. That is the real test of character. That is how dignity survives. So as you carry Jonathan's story with you, I invite you to reflect. How do we see the people around us? How quickly do we assume? And what might happen if, just once, we stopped long enough to listen, to ask, to truly see? That small pause, that single shift, might be the seed of a different future. If this story moved you, if it made you think, we welcome you to share it with others. Leave us your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep this conversation alive. And if you'd like to walk with us through more stories that carry lessons like this one, stories of struggle, dignity, and hope, please subscribe to our channel. Each story is an invitation to look deeper, to see clearer, and to live with a little more humanity. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way through. If it has brought you value, touched your heart, or given you something to think about, we invite you to share this video with others, because sometimes a story can be the spark that changes a perspective. And if this is your first time visiting our channel, or if you haven't subscribed yet, we warmly encourage you to do so today, so you won't miss the next stories we bring. Stories filled with lessons, hope, and humanity.